A wealthy woman stranded in the rain. A homeless black man offering help when everyone else looked away. What happened next turned a simple favor into a life-changing revelation. The rain poured mercilessly onto the city streets, but it wasn't the storm that made her stop. It was the figure hunched by the roadside, waving with grease-stained hands. The world around Vanessa Green had turned into a blur of headlights and wet asphalt. Her luxury SUV sat motionless in the middle of the busy downtown street, hazard lights blinking like a silent SOS into the gray afternoon. Horns honked behind her. Drivers sped past with angry gestures. Pedestrians hurried by under umbrellas, barely sparing a glance. Vanessa clenched the steering wheel tighter, her designer coat damp from running back and forth between her seat and the stubborn hood. She wasn't helpless. She was resourceful, successful. But this, engines, cables, smoke rising faintly into the mist, this was not her world. She tried dialing the roadside assistance app again, but it spun uselessly. No signal in the rain-choked chaos. Then out of the corner of her eye, she saw him. At first, he was just another blur against the brick buildings. A hunched figure in a threadbare jacket, jeans soaked to the knee, battered boots splashing through puddles. He moved with purpose, though, weaving through traffic without hesitation. And when he got closer, she saw it. His hands, calloused and stained with oil, waving toward her with an urgency that didn't ask for anything, only offered. Daniel Brooks. He wasn't wearing a name tag or a mechanic's uniform. He didn't carry a shiny toolbox. But there was something about the steadiness in his eyes, warm, tired but sharp, that made Vanessa's hand freeze on the door lock. For a moment, instinct screamed at her, "Stay in the car. Don't trust strangers." Look at him. Disheveled, homeless maybe, dangerous possibly. But then she caught the flicker of something else. Not threat, not desperation, compassion, simple, unspoken, and offered without strings. Before she could second-guess herself, Vanessa cracked the window just enough to hear his voice, rough from the cold but steady. "Ma'am," Daniel said, tipping his chin up respectfully, "looks like it's your battery connection. I can fix it real quick if you'll let me." The words tumbled out so naturally, with such quiet confidence, that for a moment Vanessa almost forgot to respond. She glanced around, at the drenched sidewalks, at the rushing cars, at the sea of people pretending not to see her stranded here. Nobody else had stopped. Nobody else even cared. The rain hammered down harder, drenching her hair and soaking through her designer shoes. She hesitated, a breath, a heartbeat, then nodded stiffly. Daniel smiled just barely. Not a salesman's grin, but a small, genuine curve of the mouth, like someone relieved to be useful again. Without another word, he moved toward the hood, his fingers working quickly, gently, like an old piano player finding familiar keys. Vanessa watched through the windshield, torn between fear and gratitude, as he adjusted cables and wiped away grime with an old rag from his pocket. Within minutes, the engine sputtered, coughed, and roared back to life. Daniel stepped back, wiping his hands on his jacket, rainwater streaming down his face. He didn't ask for money, he didn't linger expectantly, he just gave her another small nod, as if to say, "You're good now," and turned away, merging back into the blur of the rain-soaked crowd. Vanessa sat frozen, engine rumbling beneath her, heart pounding in her ears. Somewhere deep inside, something twisted. A sharp, uncomfortable feeling she couldn't name. He had saved her afternoon with nothing but his hands and his kindness, and she had almost locked the door in his face. She didn't even know his name, but she knew, in that moment, she had just witnessed a kind of grace most people spent lifetimes searching for, and something told her this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. The rain eased to a steady drizzle, misting the city in a cold, silver haze. Vanessa sat behind the wheel for a few seconds longer than necessary, engine humming, hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. Through the blurry windshield, she caught another glimpse of him, Daniel Brooks, walking away without a backward glance, soaked to the bone in his weather-beaten jacket and worn jeans, boots slapping through puddles, leaving no trace of the kindness he had just given. Vanessa shook, her head sharply, trying to clear the unease clinging to her ribs. She didn't even know who he was. A part of her, the careful part, the part that wore heels and carried $1,000 bag, still whispered, "You can't trust people like that." But another voice, quieter, deeper, gnawed at her. "Maybe you can." As she shifted into gear and pulled carefully toward the curb, she caught the sharp glances of bystanders along the sidewalk. Two women under a shared umbrella watched Daniel with pinched lips and shaking heads. A man in a pressed trench coat muttered under his breath as he passed, probably just looking for a handout. They didn't know. They didn't care to know. They saw tattered clothes, dark skin, a rough exterior, and their judgment was swift, ruthless, and absolute. Vanessa felt a flush of shame crawl up her neck. Hadn't she almost done the same? But something about Daniel stayed with her. The way he spoke, polite, soft-spoken, not desperate. The way his hands had moved under the hood of her car, not fumbling, not guessing, but with the precise, practiced ease of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. A memory tugged at her. An old friend's father who had been a mechanic. Years ago, she remembered how he had handled engines like living things, gentle, firm, confident. That was Daniel, not a grifter, not a threat, a man who knew his craft in his bones, even if the world no longer saw him. Vanessa gripped the steering, wheel tighter as she drove slowly through the rain, glancing at the sidewalks, scanning the crowd. Where had he gone? Was he just going to vanish again, swallowed by a city too busy to notice? Part of her wanted to floor the gas pedal, speed back to her office, shake off this strange encounter like water from her coat. But another part of her, stubborn, aching, needed to know who was Daniel Brooks. How had a man with hands that sure, that skilled, ended up invisible on the streets? The SUV's tires hissed over wet asphalt as Vanessa merged back into traffic, heart heavier than before. Behind her, the city swallowed the street corner where a homeless man had offered help without asking for a thing in return. And ahead of her, unknown and urgent, lay the beginning of a story she couldn't yet understand, but somehow, deep in her gut, knew she needed to finish. The rain fell in steady sheets now, washing the sidewalks clean, making every neon sign shimmer like it floated on a river of glass. Vanessa leaned against the side of her SUV, arms folded tightly across her chest, watching with cautious fascination as Daniel Brooks worked under the hood. He moved like a man who had done this 1,000 times before. No wasted motion, no fumbling. His fingers, rough and scarred, danced across the engine with a surgeon's precision. The battered toolbox he carried had seen better days. The wrench he used was old, nicked and worn from years of calloused hands, but the skill behind every twist and adjustment was undeniable. While he worked, Daniel hummed to himself, low and rhythmic, an old blues tune that seemed almost to merge with the rain. It wasn't loud enough for Vanessa to recognize the song, but it wrapped around the moment like a memory. Neither of them spoke aloud. She shifted uncomfortably, wanting to say something, to thank him, to ask who he was, but every time words almost formed on her tongue. She caught the set of his jaw, the quiet focus in his eyes. This wasn't just some random act. This was muscle memory. This was a life he had once lived. "You really know what you're doing," Vanessa said finally, her voice sounding too loud in the wet, muted world. Daniel only smiled, tightening one last connection. "Used to run my own shop once," he said almost casually, as if the words had slipped out before he could catch them. Vanessa opened her mouth to ask more. Where? When? What happened? But Daniel had already turned his attention. Back to the engine. The opportunity drifted away like mist. His hands were coated in grease and rainwater, but they moved with a kind of reverence, almost like he was tending to something sacred. Not just a machine, something living, breathing, a piece of himself. He could still control. Vanessa studied him in silence, the drizzle matting his short black hair to his scalp, his jacket clinging to a lean frame worn thinner by hardship. He didn't look up, didn't boast, didn't beg for recognition. He simply did the work, quietly, steadily, because it needed to be done. She noticed then, really noticed, the deep lines etched at the corners of his eyes, the slight limp in his step when he moved, the tired weight he carried in his shoulders. Not the weight of laziness, the weight of someone who had built something once and lost it all. When the engine finally rumbled back to life, Daniel closed the hood with a decisive click. He wiped his hands on a rag pulled from his pocket, then stepped back, giving her space. Vanessa dug through her purse instinctively, fingers brushing over her wallet. But before she could pull out any bills, Daniel shook his head. "Nah," he said, softly. "You just take care of yourself, ma'am. That's enough for me." His voice was rough, but there was no bitterness in it, only a tired kindness that wrapped around her like a blanket she didn't know she needed. He turned to leave, his boots splashing in the shallow puddles, shoulders hunched against the cold. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't even look back. The crowd swallowed him, a blur of umbrellas and raincoats and hurried steps, until all Vanessa could see was the faint ripple of his passing. She stood there a long time after he disappeared, rain soaking into her hair, her coat, the cracks in her polished facade. Something twisted hard inside her. Not guilt exactly. Something deeper. A realization. She had almost locked her doors when she saw him coming. Had almost treated him like the others had. A threat, a burden, a shadow. Instead, he had treated her with more grace, more patience, more humanity than most of the people she shook hands with at gala events and charity fundraisers. Vanessa climbed back into her SUV, the leather seat cold and uninviting beneath her. As she drove through the misty streets, her mind stayed fixed on him. The way his hands had moved, the glimpse of quiet pride behind his tired eyes. Used to run my own shop once. What had happened to him? How had someone like that ended up invisible, forgotten, living under the gray sky with nothing but a battered toolbox and a song under his breath? Vanessa didn't have the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't just drive away and forget. Not this time. The rain had long since dried, but Vanessa couldn't shake the weight that lingered in her chest. Days turned into restless nights, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, Daniel Brooks, walking away into the mist, swallowed by a city that didn't see him. She didn't know why she cared. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was curiosity, but more than anything, it was the feeling that she had witnessed something rare, and if she turned away, she would be no better than all the strangers who had stepped over him without a second thought. On the third day, Vanessa found herself standing in front of a weathered brick building tucked between a payday loan office and an abandoned laundromat, a homeless shelter, a place she had driven past 100 times without ever truly seeing. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of worn blankets and lukewarm coffee. A woman behind the front desk, gray-haired and kind-eyed, looked up as Vanessa entered. "I'm looking for someone," Vanessa said, feeling suddenly foolish in her expensive coat and polished heels. "His name is Daniel Brooks." Recognition flickered across the woman's face. "Daniel's a good man," she said softly. "Hard life, but a good man." Vanessa hesitated, then asked the question that had haunted her since that rainy afternoon. What happened to him? The woman's smile turned bittersweet. "He used to own a shop, Brooks Automotive, right off Grand Street. Best mechanic in town. People trusted him." She sighed, hands folding together. Then a drunk driver totaled his shop. Daniel tried to rebuild, but he got hurt pulling someone out of a wreck a few months later. Hospital bills buried him. Insurance denied his claim. He lost everything. The business, his apartment, his savings. And well, she didn't have to finish. Vanessa felt her throat tighten. This wasn't some tragic statistic. This was a man with gifted hands and a kind heart, reduced to living in the shadows because the world decided he didn't matter anymore. She left the shelter with a plan burning inside her. Vanessa called in favors, leaned on her connections, moved money quietly through a charitable foundation she sat on. Paperwork that would have taken months was pushed through in weeks. The small debts that had chained Daniel to the street were erased as if they had never existed. Finally, she found a small rundown garage space for rent on the edge of town. Nothing glamorous but solid. A place where engines could roar again, where grease could seep into cracked floors and hope could grow from concrete. She didn't tell him. She didn't announce her name. She simply made the path easier, left the door open for him to walk through if he chose, and he did. 1 month later, Vanessa pulled into the gravel lot in her newly serviced SUV. The afternoon sun gleamed off the fresh coat of paint on the garage's crooked sign. Brooks Garage, second chances given here. Standing in the open bay, wiping his hands on a clean rag, was Daniel Brooks. Not in a soaked jacket this time, but in clean work clothes, a navy shirt with his name stitched neatly over the pocket. He looked up as she stepped out, and for a heartbeat, neither spoke. The world buzzed around them, cars passing on the highway, birds calling in the trees, but inside that small space everything was still. Daniel smiled first. A slow, genuine smile that carried the weight of a man who had fought for every inch back to where he stood. "Welcome," he said simply, voice rough but steady. "What can I do for you today?" Vanessa smiled back, a lump rising in her throat. "Just an oil change," she managed to say. "And maybe a little hope." He laughed, rich and warm, the sound echoing off the cinder block walls. And in that moment, under the fading afternoon light, it didn't matter who wore the designer suit or who wore the grease-stained shirt. It didn't matter who had fallen or who had reached out. All that mattered was that both of them were standing, stronger than before, because one act of kindness had dared to break the cycle. The afternoon sun bathed the small garage in a warm, forgiving light, casting long golden streaks across the worn concrete floor. The faint smell of motor oil and fresh paint mingled in the air, grounding the moment in something real, something earned. Vanessa stood just outside the bay doors, arms wrapped loosely around herself, her heart too full for words. Inside, Daniel Brooks worked with the same humble, methodical care he had shown the day she first met him, when the rain soaked them both, when the world had been content to look the other way. He crouched by her SUV now, checking fluid levels, inspecting every bolt with a meticulous eye. His movements were steady, deliberate, the kind of hands-on craftsmanship that no degree, no title, no polished resume could ever replicate. This was pride. This was dignity. And it was here, alive again, because someone had dared to see it. Vanessa blinked rapidly, trying to clear the tears that blurred her vision. Not tears of guilt, not even tears of pity, tears of gratitude that she had been lucky enough to cross paths with a man like Daniel. From across the garage, Daniel looked up and caught her gaze. He gave her a small, knowing smile, the same kind of smile he had offered on that rainy day, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, and it shattered whatever walls she still had left inside. He didn't know how much he had changed her. He didn't know how much he had reminded her, in a world obsessed with appearances and status, of what truly mattered. Never judge a person by their circumstances. Talent, dignity, and kindness often hide where the world least expects them. Daniel closed the hood of the SUV with a soft click and wiped his hands on a clean cloth. He didn't rush, didn't boast. He simply walked over, offered her the keys, with a nod as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. But it wasn't ordinary. It was extraordinary. "Thank you, Daniel," she said, her voice catching slightly. "Always happy to help," he replied, his tone easy, genuine. Vanessa gripped the keys tightly, feeling the small, cool weight of them press into her palm like a reminder. A reminder that kindness ripples outward in ways we can't always see. She turned to leave, but before she did, she looked back one last time. Daniel stood under the faded sign. Brooks Garage, second chances given here. Silhouetted against the golden light, a man who had lost everything but never surrendered who he was. He hadn't just fixed her car that day. He had rebuilt something far more valuable. Hope, pride, a second chance, not just for himself, but for everyone willing to believe that broken things could be made whole again. And this time, the world had no choice but to see him.